Greetings. Hello, everyone. My name is Marianne Hunt, and I'm the director of the Travel Learn program at Tufts University. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Shared Departures, the webinar series in which Brown, Harvard, and Tufts University provide the opportunity to explore and learn about the destinations we love around the world from the comfort of your own home. Today's talk, Italy in Focus, features speakers Louis Edgers of Tufts, Massimo Riva of Brown, and Sue Weaver-Shupp of Harvard University, who will also serve as the moderator. You'll see amongst them, they have a great depth of knowledge in Venice, and so that's the city we're going to take a deep dive into today. But before I turn things over to Professor Shupp, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom webinar. For the duration of the panel, your video and microphone will be turned off so that we can direct our attention to the speakers. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find several buttons to interact with. If you have questions for the panelists, please only insert them in the Q&A box. You'll also see a chat box, which is intended for comments, sharing information, and engaging with your fellow attendees. To chat to the entire audience, please select all panelists and attendees when submitting your comment. If you'd like to hide this chat feature, you may do so by moving the chat feed to the side of your screen. Closed captioning is also available, and you'll find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, please send a message to our support team by selecting Shared Support in the chat. Alternatively, this program is also being live streamed to YouTube, so if you wish, you could join us there. Please find the YouTube link in the chat now. Today's webinar will be recorded. In the post-lecture follow-up, you'll receive an email from your institution that includes a link to the recording. Finally, we appreciate your patience should we experience any unexpected technical glitches or delays due to the nature of our virtual environment. Now, in the spirit of travel, I'd like to kick things off by encouraging you to share your location and the university affiliation in the chat box. Great, this will be fun. And now I'm really happy to be introducing our moderator and speaker, Sue Weaver-Shupp, the Distinguished Service Lecturer at Harvard University Extension School. Sue recently retired from the position of Associate Dean and Director of the Master of Liberal Arts program at the Harvard Extension School, where she also served for nearly 30 years as Research Advisor in the Humanities. Sue, now I'm happy to pass the mic over to you to tell us more about what you and our other speakers will talk about today. The virtual stage is all yours.
Thank you, Marianne. I am delighted to be with all of you today, as the three of us are, to present in this Shared Departures webinar. Of course, when one was invited to talk about Italy, one could talk about many, many different things. We could have spoken about the beauties of Florence or Rome or Pisa, or the Italian Lake District or the Cinque Terre, but we have decided to narrow our focus today to Venice, in part because of its uniqueness, its rich history, the story of its rise and fall, which is very dramatic, its art, its architecture, its music, and especially the mystique of a magnificent city of stone floating on water. And so that's what we're going to be discussing in different ways today. Our topics will range from the environmental crises facing Venice to the city's history of visual and literary representations. I will tell you very briefly a little bit more about myself. I've been teaching British literature at Harvard for more than 40 years, while also serving as Associate Dean in the Master of Liberal Arts program in the Division of Continuing Education. But my special interest in both research and teaching is in developing courses and spring break trips for my students that actually explore what I call the spirit of place. We do this by visiting the homes and haunts and settings of the writers and artists that we're studying in the course. And we do this specifically because we want to understand how writers and artists employ these both imaginary and realistic geographies, how they employ that in their work. And so, of course, Venice is ideal from my point of view because everything about Venice looks exactly as it did centuries ago. And so it's very easy to walk in the footsteps of writers and to show students how vividly those writers will represent the magnificence of the Venetian setting. So Let me now introduce you to my distinguished colleagues who will be presenting with me today. I'm delighted to have Professor Louis Edgers of Tufts University and Professor Massimo Riva of Brown University. Louis Edgers is a professor emeritus of civil and environmental engineering at Tufts, a professional engineer and fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Professor Edgers is especially interested in the relationship between people and their environment. His most recent research is focused on green energy within the context of global climate change, energy sustainability, and infrastructure resilience. Today, Lou will discuss the challenges of flooding, tourism, and ground subsidence in Venice. Professor Massimo Riva is professor of Italian studies at Brown University. Educated in Italy and the United States, Professor Riva has published on a wide range of topics, from Boccaccio's Decameron to national identity in modern Italian culture, and the future of literature in the digital age. His digital monograph, Italian Shadows, A Curious History of Virtual Reality, is part of the Brown Digital Publications Initiative and is forthcoming from Stanford University Press. Massimo will discuss the making of a virtual Venetian city. The three of us would also like to acknowledge and thank the staffs of Harvard and Brown and Tufts for giving us the opportunity to speak about Venice today. Lou, I'm delighted to hand the mic over to you now.
There. I hope you can all hear me. I on occasion accidentally mute myself. I'll try not to do that this time. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm noticing in the chat the number of friends, colleagues, former students from Tufts, and it's always nice to see that. But it's also a pleasure to be meeting folks from Harvard and Brown. As Sue stated, I am a civil environmental engineer. I come from this discipline, subspecialty area called geotechnical engineering, or geosystems engineering. And my interest is in understanding and in studying the relationship between human activities and the earth environment. And that typically will mean soil, rock, and water. And within that context, Venice is a very, very rich place for me to study. And so what I'll try to talk about is the environmental challenges posed by soil and water in Venice. Here you see the photograph of St. Mark's Square, and there's the water. You'll be hearing much more about arts and humanities from our other speakers, but I could not resist a little bit of poetry from Lord Byron, Ode on Venice. O Venice, Venice, when thy marble walls are level with the waters, there shall be a cry of nations o'er thy sunken halls, a loud lament along the sweeping sea. It's interesting, Sue used the expression, the rise and fall of Venice. And when I hear that, I think of the rise of the water and the subsidence of the land. So it can have many different kinds of meanings. Venice lies within a very complicated geologic environment. If you follow my pointer, here is the city of Venice that we all know. And it's, I hate to use the word high, but it's higher than the area around it. But it's within what the Venetian lagoon. That lagoon consists of some landed areas. You can see Cavallino, Lido, and Palestrina. These are barrier islands, which actually served as very important elements over the military life of Venice hundreds of years ago, because they provide barriers as well to people who are trying to attack the city. In addition, you can see by the blue and by a little bit of orange, there's a lot of water, and a lot of this is very shallow water. And these are what we would call mud flats. Within the mud flats, you can see by the deeper blue, heavily channels that have been dredged through the outlets. There's the Lido outlet, Malamocco, and Chioggia. And these are channels for providing maritime access to not only the city, but to other important areas. You'll notice, by the way, there's an airport at the far end, and Porto Marghera. This is really the heavily industrialized part of the lagoon. You can notice the oil channel, and you can imagine that's used to transmit product back and forth to the refinery district. So it's very, very complicated geologically. Oh, and last but not least, there are fishing areas, and these fishing areas go back historically hundreds and hundreds of years, which have supported the fishing industry of the area. The lagoon has many, many uses. We, of course, know about the tourism and cultural heritage. Cultural heritage meaning, of course, the art, the architecture, the music that Venice serves as a transmitter of. There are also important ecological uses, ecological elements. There are salt marshes. You can see the salt marsh in the middle here. Salt marshes are very important in providing habitat for providing vegetation and habitat for animals. Barrier islands, salt marshes are also very important in providing buffer for flood control. You can see a barrier island at the bottom. You can see elements of the tourism. There are the ever-present gondolas, and you can see the main city of Venice. Notice the very large tour ship in the background, which hovers. The port of Venice is a very important industrial resource to the region, and it has a major refinery. And as well, there is fishing. So there are many, many uses of the lagoon, and these uses, of course, are associated with various risks. There are major flood risks, and I'll talk much more about those in a while. There are erosion problems in the barrier islands and along the mainland coast. Part of the erosion occurs in part due to storms as well. That's one of the issues associated with a large cruise ship tension that's developing these days. The lagoon is not a place for water to easily circulate. So there are industrial discharges, domestic discharges, discharges from agricultural operations that end up in the lagoon, and the lagoon is severely polluted. The last two elements, the best character, I don't know how many of you are aware of that great American philosopher, Yogi Berra, but Yogi had an expression to describe going to Yankee Stadium. Yogi would say that there's so much traffic going to the Yankee Stadium that nobody goes there anymore. And so that's part of the tension in Venice. The permanent residency in Venice is now less than 60,000 people. On the other hand, tourism provides an enormous pressure. There's a tension because it provides income as well as pressure, and tens of millions of people visit the city every year. So there's certainly one of the major risks. And finally, there's a loss of habitat. You can see that in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, where some of the marshes have begun to be attacked by all of the activity in the area. Okay, this next slide is probably the most technical of the slides I'm going to present. I'm sorry for that, maybe not. And this refers to the rise and fall of Venice. The horizontal axis provides a timeline from about 1908 to 2015, and the vertical axis plots heights, elevations. And so the blue represents the rise in sea level during this time from 1908 to 2015. And you can see that over just this period, there's been a rise in sea level of about 12 centimeters. 12 centimeters is a little more than, is about 5 inches. The lower half, the fall part of it, shows you the settlement and subsidence that has occurred in the city of Venice. Venice is built on soft soils. Soft soils will naturally settle, naturally subside, but that subsidence is aggravated by human activities induced by human beings. So over the period from 1908 to 2015, there's been about 13 centimeters of ground subsidence at this location. So when you add the rise of the water and the subsidence of the land, that totals about 25 centimeters. That's about 10 inches, which represents, therefore, a 10-inch loss of ground to the sea over this period of time. And that's a very important factor. The other other element that we should be talking about are aqua alta events. Aqua alta floods are recurring low-level floods. They occur due to storms coming up the Adriatic. They're astronomical high tides. Seiches, a standing waves. If you don't know what a standing wave is, just imagine a child jumping into a bathtub and how the waves in the bathtub keep going back and forth. The Adriatic can be seen as a bathtub because it's very enclosed on three sides. There are floods from the land side and the rivers, and then there's a possibility of climate change. The figure on the lower left-hand side of the slide shows you again a timeline, and each vertical black line represents an aqua alta event, recurring low-level floods. I've also tabulated them for you on the right-hand side, and I've circled the November 1966 flood, which occurred which had a height of about 1.94 meters. That's about 6 feet, and that's the most severe aqua alta flood that has been observed over the recorded time. You'll notice also from the figure that these floods they're becoming more frequent. Okay, moving on, you can see the effects. You can see my opening slide over here, and you can see people trying to conduct business in the midst of this flooding. And of course, there are always folks who never miss the opportunity for recreation under these extreme events. Of course, I'd like to know who's pulling this guy. Is there a motorboat in there or not? I don't know. And here you can see St. Mark's Square during the 1966 record surge. And here you can see one building, Palace Flangini. It's in a painting, and then in the 2002 photograph, and you can see the loss of headboard to the sea over this period of time. And here's a piece of art. On our installation showing the sea grabbing the buildings. So what are the Italians doing about this? Well, the project that's attracted most attention is the MOSE project. It protects the lagoon from high tides from the Adriatic Sea by temporarily closing the three major inlets with mobile gates. Here you can see the mobile gates at the bottom. When not in use, these gates presumably are down and presumably would not affect the natural exchange of water between the sea and the lagoon and not interfere with port activities. The Moses project consists of an array there are 78 of these very heavy gates supported by these concrete caissons. And when it becomes time to deploy the gates, air is pumped into them to reduce their weight, and they then rotate over a pivot to this particular location, hence protecting the lagoon from the storm-induced sea waters. And that's what they look like. This is one of those large caissons. There are 26 of them. They're enormous. And then here are these 300-ton gates. Here's another photo of the caisson and the gates. You can tell by the cars and the individuals the scale of the project. This is what it will look like. It looks like at Lido, in the Lido Channel. Here you can see a couple of secondary structures. There's a new island, and then the gates are constructed between landside and the new island, and that's the gate at the Lido Channel that has already been installed. Okay, in the interest of time, we don't really have the time to talk more about the MOSE project right now, other than to say it's been a 20-year story. It's an interesting story. I don't have the time. I've given you some references, and if you'd like to talk about it more, if you ask the questions, maybe we can discuss it during the Q&A period. So I think this would be a good time to turn it over to Massimo. So I would now introduce you to Massimo Rivo, our colleague from Brown, who will be talking next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou. And I'm starting my slideshow. It's a pleasure to be with you. And of course, we will now switch from heavy machinery to much lighter media. It would be nice to trust the opinion of this Venetian citizen, probably among the most knowledgeable about the city's ecosystem. He's portrayed here on the cover of a Venetian magazine devoted to stories of civic resistance. As we all know, however, and as you just mentioned, there is another threat menacing the city, us. Notoriously overwhelmed by masses of tourism before COVID, Venice, during the pandemic, has become a kind of forlorn paradise, deserted Calli and Campi, San Marco, dolphins sighted in the canals, etc. The only touristic presence in the city over the past year has been of the virtual kind. You could pretend to be seated at a cafe in Piazza San Marco watching a 360 video on YouTube, and no risk of getting your feet wet in the Acqua Alta either. This kind of virtual travel is not an entirely new phenomenon as far as Venice is concerned. It dates back at least to Francesco Sansovino's 1561 guidebook, Venetia, città nobilissima et singolare, which translates as a most noble and singular city in the double meaning of the word unique and peculiar. A major destination on the Grand Tour in the 18th century, the 900-year-old Serenissima, the most serene, as the Republic of Venice was also known, could count 100 theaters and a 9-month-long carnival season, and was itself a spectacle to be viewed rather than a place to be discovered, as Rosemary Sweet writes. However, in the age of mass tourism, the magical spectacle of the city has been reduced to a battered peep show and a bazaar, as Henry James was already writing back in 1909. Venice has been painted and described and photographed, we may add, many thousands of times, and of all the cities of the world, it is the easiest to visit without going there, James also wrote. 150 years ago, for example, people could travel to Venice through the stereoscope, thanks to a virtual travel system developed by the Kansas-based Underwood and Underwood brothers. In this stereograph, one of the brothers shows us how to use the system. Complete with maps and guidebooks, these kits could provide the experience of being there without leaving the comfort of one's home. Some tourists even took the kit with them and used it on site, perhaps to see if in real life Venice lived up to its images. As this simulation taken from my digital book shows, looking through the stereoscope, one could imagine oneself floating on a gondola at the Riva degli Schiavoni, gazing at the Doge Palace, the side of San Marco in the distance. Or, switching the view, one could glide under the Bridge of Sighs, perhaps reciting by heart Lord Byron's immortal verses, as Sue will tell you shortly. 150 years earlier, during the age of the Grand Tour, the painter who most contributed to the virtualization of Venice was, of course, Antonio Canal, nicknamed Canaletto, and what an appropriate name for a Venetian painter, the most famous representative of the Venetian school of vedutisti, or painters of views. Indeed, Canaletto's views captured the city's magical light, its aura and singularity so well that they became identified with Venice. If you could not travel to Venice, you could conceive a visit from a good Canaletti, as the Duchess of Chichester wrote to her son, Thomas Pelham. She was worried about Venice's bad reputation for its gambling establishments and brothels. Take this classic view of the basin, the Piazzetta and the Ducal Palace on Ascension Day. A spectacular parade of gondolas, including the Bucintoro, the Doge's ceremonial ship, which on the right, you can see it, because of its decorative weight, could barely float. Compare it with this rare footage from 1912. The film was hand-colored, and this is what actually Henry James could have looked at if we were in the city at that time. On this day, Ascension Day, the Doge celebrated the annual propitiatory rite of the wedding of the sea established in the year 1000 by throwing a precious ring into the water of the lagoon to keep it under the yoke of the most serene republic, or perhaps in modern times as an exorcism to keep the sea from submerging the city. If Piazza San Marco was the social hub where everyone paraded and every activity in Venice converged, the Piazzetta, with its two columns facing the basin and Andrea Palladio's dome on the island of San Giorgio visible in the distance, could be described as the foyer of a theater. Indeed, with the construction of ephemeral shacks and stalls called casotti, you can see them there, the Piazzetta would from time to time play host to a variety of exotic attractions and performances, as seen in this painting by Gabriel Bella entitled The Charlatans in the Piazzetta. Here in the Piazzetta, late 18th century tourists, such as Goethe or William Beckford, could run into a singular attraction. Who wants to see the Mondo Nuovo? Who wants to see the new world? Cried itinerant hawkers, also known as a cosmorama, a pantoscope, or more popularly, a peep show box. The Mondo Nuovo was an ornate box with small portals through which the viewer could enjoy distances and perspectives. Here are other images of the Mondo Nuovo in the background of two vignettes of Venetian life painted by Pietro Longhi. We often see such works multiplied by the inventors in the piazza, wrote Carlo Goldoni, the most famous Venetian playwright of the 18th century, in a poem. And especially during carnival time, people come running around them and go crazy to see them. No image better illustrates these verses than this painting by Gian Domenico Tiepolo, the son of Giambattista Tiepolo, the greatest illusionist of the Rococo age. Both Tiepolos, father and son, are mixed in with the crowd. Here is Gian Domenico looking through a monocle over the shoulders of his famous father to emphasize the playful nature of this optical composition. Here is a simulation of the Mondo Nuovo also created for my digital book. For a coin, a tourist could admire Venice from afar and then sail to the city on the river Brenta, on the ferry called the Burchiello, as this view by Canaletto shows. Venetians, on the other hand, could enjoy a virtual version of their own city, including special effects. Here's Piazza San Marco, special effects that made the virtual view even more magical than the actual place. How was it done? The prints, such as this Canaletto view of the Arsenale, the famous Venetian shipyard, were artfully perforated and colored pieces of cloth glued to the back. When aptly illuminated by natural light or by candles positioned inside the Mondo Nuovo, they produced the wondrous day-to-night effect. Here is a simulation of another attraction that tourists might have encountered in the Piazzetta 2.5 centuries ago, a walk-in Mondo Nuovo, invented by Domenico Selva, a famous Venetian lens maker. In the middle of the casotto, there was a large basin on the floor enclosed by a balustrade, an optical apparatus positioned on the roof, turning slowly, projected on the floor the animated images of the world outside. This walk-in camera obscura, a forerunner of virtual reality, also worked as a candid camera. From inside the casotto, one could also spy unseen on the people outside. Canaletto himself used the camera obscura to capture the spectacle of the city. These three small paintings show the actual view one could have enjoyed from inside the Selva's casotto. Part of the collection sold by the British consul in Venice, Joseph Smith, to King George III, they were probably intended to be incorporated symmetrically into the decoration of a single Venetian room at Windsor Castle. Entering the room, George III or royal visitors thus could have the illusion of being in Venice. In short, this room was a replica of the peep show on the Piazzetta. Here is another painting by Canaletto, a view of the Grand Canal, though you can tell that it is not the Rialto Bridge we are actually looking at, but a building somewhat reminiscent of the US Capitol's facade. Indeed, this 1757 painting belongs to the genre called capriccio, a fantasy or invention. To be precise, a capriccio with Palladian architecture. It imagines a virtual architectural gallery on the Grand Canal, featuring some of the most famous buildings designed by Andrea Palladio, the Olympic Theatre in Vicenza on the right. In conclusion, Italo Calvino perfectly summed things up in his masterpiece, Invisible Cities, an imaginary dialogue between the Venetian Marco Polo and the Emperor Kublai Khan. In its singularity, Venice is also a blueprint of all the other cities of the world. A virtual city, a perfect city made of fragments of all the cities that exist or can be imagined. The Mondo Nuovo perfectly encapsulates this idea, the whole world in a box, and the box is Venice. So if Venice dies, as Salvatore Settis warns us, cruise ships are back in Venice like before COVID, an entire world would be lost, a whole cosmorama would disappear, and we would be left with its peculiar virtual copies, such as the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. So thank you for your attention, and now I'll turn over my screen, or should I say my peep show, to Sue.
Well, now I'm going to take you on a very rapid visit of Venice through the lives of three particular artists. This is going to be a very, very quick walking tour, but I hope to show you something of what these three artists themselves experienced while they were in Venice. So first of all, here is a very long list of writers and artists and composers who have been inspired by Venice. The list is far too long, of course, for us to cover in many different webinars or even several different courses. But I wanted you to see on the left the very important authors who have written about Venice, who have made Venice central to some of their most important works, who came to Venice, who stayed for various periods of time, and who absorbed the environment of Venice and made it something very special by translating what they saw into language. On the right side, you'll see a list of some of the painters who came from Venice and who are associated with Venice. And of course, the list again is very long and very impressive. And then at the very bottom, three of the composers who are most closely associated with Venice: Vivaldi, Monteverdi, and Cavalli. But today there is time only to mention three of these, and in very faint detail. First of all, we're going to see one poet, Lord Byron, who is so closely associated with Venice, one nonfiction prose writer, John Ruskin, who of course is perhaps the most important architectural critic of Venice of the 19th century, and then finally one very important novelist associated with Venice, and that is Henry James. So the first question that we always ask is, what exactly drew writers and artists to Venice? And I have two quotations here, which I think actually do very well towards telling us something about the magic of the place. From John Ruskin himself: "Since first the dominion of men was asserted over the ocean, 3 thrones of mark beyond all others have been set upon its sands, the thrones of Tyre, Venice, and England. Of the first of these great powers, only the memory remains. Of the second, the ruin. And of course, it is Venice as a ruin that both makes it a romantic site to writers, but also a rather tragic site. And then from Tony Tanner's book, Venice Desired, a couple of other brief quotes, which I think really sort of embody the spirit of Venice. If there is one city that might be said to embody both reason and desire, it would surely be Venice. A 1,000-year triumph of rational legislation, aesthetic and sensual self-expression and self-creation, powerful, lovely, serene, but also watery, dark, silent, a place of sensuality and secrecy, of masks and masquerading, of an always possibly treacherous beauty, of Desdemona and Iago, Shylock, Volpone, of conspiracy and courtesans in Otway. So it is that incredible combination of its physical beauty, the tragedy of its decaying presence, the fact of its former glory, and of course, the association with carnival, with naughtiness, with transgressiveness. And these are labels that have all sort of adhered to the image of Venice. And it's the image, or the very complicated set of images, that writers and artists have been drawn to. So the first visit we're going to make is to Lord Byron. Byron is, of all the poets, the one who is most closely associated with Venice, because he stayed here for a few years. And in living in Venice, he rented the Palazzo Mocenigo. He had no money. He was already exiled from England because of scandal and bad behavior. But in Byron's time, it was possible, if you were titled and if you were thought to be a wealthy person, you could rent something like this without putting any money down for rather a long time, until the creditors came running after you, as they had done in England. But he rented this very grand palace. He kept his mistresses there. He kept a menagerie of animals that ranged from parrots and wolves to dogs and cats and llamas. And so it was quite a noisy and chaotic place. But this is where he wrote for about 2 years, and he completed actually some of his most important works here. One of the most important poems that Byron wrote over time was Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. It was the story of a young man wandering across Europe and wandering across some of the great sites of the past and meditating upon the fact that they existed no longer. And so, of course, naturally, he comes to Venice, and Venice, of course, typifies the city of former greatness now fallen into ruins. And the speaker of the poem, of course, is melancholy and wonders if anything endures. So I'll read you just a little bit from the beginning of Canto 4 of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is set in Venice. I stood in Venice on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand. I saw from out the wave her structures rise, as from the stroke of the enchanter's wand. 1,000 years their cloudy wings expand around me, and a dying glory smiles o'er the far times, when many a subject land looked to the winged lion's marble piles, where Venice sat in state, throned on her 100 isles. In Venice, Tasso's echoes are no more, and silent rose the songless gondolier. Her palaces are crumbling to the shore, and music meets not always now the ear. Those days are gone, but beauty still is here. States fall, arts fade, but nature doth not die, nor yet forget how Venice once was dear, the pleasant place of all festivity, the revel of the earth, the mask of Italy. Well, that's Byron in a rather sentimental and nostalgic mood, but then there's another side of Lord Byron, which is probably the one that is most familiar to people. And this is the Byron of scandal. This is the Byron who was very pleased to write to one of his friends that he had bedded more than 200 women during the most recent carnival. And of course, he writes a very interesting satiric poem about bad behavior during carnival, and it is called Beppo, I'll read you just a tiny bit of that. "'Tis known, at least it should be, throughout all countries of the Catholic persuasion, some weeks before Shrove Tuesday comes about, the people take their fill of recreation, and by repentance ere they grow devout, however high their rank or low their station, with fiddling, feasting, dancing, drinking, masking, and other things which may be had for asking. Of all the places where the carnival was most facetious in the days of yore, for dance and song and serenade and ball, and mask and mime and mystery and more, than I have time to tell now, or at all, Venice the belle from every city bore, and at the moment when I fix my story, that sea-born city was in all her glory." So, of course, two sides to Byron, two sides to his poetry, the sentimental, the thoughtful, the philosophical, but also the fun-loving, the ribald, the very sexual, who loves to tell stories of infidelity and sexual indiscretion. Well, the second person I want to mention to you is quite the opposite on the moral spectrum for Lord Byron, and this is John Ruskin, who was the greatest art critic of the 19th century. He authored the 3-volume work called The Stones of Venice, which is to this day the most detailed description and analysis of the architecture of Venice. One of the more interesting theories that he had was that a city's architecture embodies its morality. And he was a particular lover of Venetian Gothic architecture. He referred to Venice, as that palace of cities. And because of the Gothic buildings that he found in Venice, he associates this with a time when Venice was devoted to religion and to spirituality, but he also associates the loss of that with specifically the loss of religion and the commercial interest that only grew in Venice by the time we get to the Renaissance. Here are two of Ruskin's residences during his 16 stays in Venice, both of which, of course, one can now stay in. The Hotel Daniele, which is one of the most glamorous and beautiful hotels in the world, and then a more modest place, the Pensione La Calcina. In addition to his deep admiration for the Piazza San Marco and the way that the magnificent buildings of the Doge's Palace and the Basilica of San Marco opened up to view when one entered the piazza, he spoke with the greatest admiration for two of these buildings here. The first, of course, is the Basilica of St. Mark's. And part of why he liked it so much is that he thought it was unique in that it showed us the evolution of 3 different styles, the Byzantine, the Arabic, and the Gothic. And you could witness this in a single building. And then, of course, the Ducal Palace, the Doge's Palace, which is his favorite building in Venice, which he called the central building of the world and our Parthenon. He saw this as the epitome of the Gothic style and the epitome of what he believed to be the spiritual expression within architecture. In the 3rd volume of The Stones of Venice, he actually goes up the Grand Canal and describes in detail each of the palazzi, each of the buildings that he sees there. And he especially likes those, of course, that have Venetian Gothic details. For example, the beautiful Cadoro on the left, because of its magnificent arched windows, its magnificent trefoils, all of the ornamentation that clearly comes from the Gothic school. But the building he doesn't like is the neoclassical building by Palladio, the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore. He disliked Renaissance architecture and he disliked neoclassical architecture because to him they were rigid, they were rule-based, and they lacked the openness, the expressiveness that he saw in Gothic architecture. The final person that we're going to walk with ever so briefly today is the great novelist Henry James. And here he is in a painting that was done by John Singer Sargent. We've already heard his quote that there are some disagreeable things in Venice, but nothing so disagreeable as the visitors. And we've also heard the quote that Venice has been painted and described thousands of times, and of all the cities of the world is the easiest to visit without actually going there. He wrote 7 works that were set in Italy. He loved Italy above all other countries, and 2 of them, of course, he set in Venice, the Aspirin Papers and the Wings of the Dove. And here are 2 of his residences in Venice, again, also both of which you can still visit. The Pensione Wildner, and then the magnificent Casa Alvisi, which has this wonderful view of the Santa Maria della Salute, which he describes in detail in Italian Hours. The one that is most closely associated with him, however, is the Palazzo Barbaro. And this is where James often stayed as a guest of the wealthy Bostonians, Daniel Sargent Curtis and Ariana Curtis. Here he completed the Aspirin Papers, and in describing the interior of the main character's drawing room, he picks up on those themes of the faded beauty, the faded elegance, which suggests, of course, a grandeur of old, but one that has been lost. And he emphasizes things like the brown colored pictures, the battered and tarnished frames, and so on. It has been said that he probably had in mind the salon of the Palazzo Barbaro in a painting we see here by Ludwig Passini. And that painting does show you something of the magnificence, the glamour, but also the fading beauty of the drawing room, which he probably had in mind when he was writing the Aspirin Papers. The last thing to mention about that rather extraordinary setting of the Palazzo Barbaro is that it was became sort of the center of art. Daniel Sargent Curtis was the cousin, actually, of John Singer Sargent, the painter, and he had a coterie of friends who were artists and writers who congregated there at the Palazzo Barbaro. And they included people such as not only Sargent, but James McNeill Whistler, Robert Browning, Monet, Bernard Berenson, William Merritt Chase, Edith Wharton, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and Charles Eliot Norton. So I love taking my students on trips, walking tours of Venice, because we are mindful of the fact that we are walking in the footsteps of so many of these great writers and painters, and we're able to see in Venice exactly what they saw in their own time. So at this point, I would like to invite my colleagues to come back on screen with me so that we can have a discussion about our 3 presentations and see, first of all, if they have questions about any of the things that we've said. I certainly have questions, but I'll give Lou and Massimo the opportunity to go first.
Thank you, Sue. That was quite a Venetian stroll you took us on in the company of these writers. I have a question. You know, among the visitors, the artists, the writers, the painters associated with the Grand Tour since the 17th century, the British seem to be in a great majority, and of course you focused on that. Also, Americans later on, but it looks like Venice was a special place for the British, and from different points of view, of course, depending on the time they visited. But as for the French, for instance, was Rome more attractive, although they also went to Venice. I wonder whether there is something more you can say about this sort of a sentimental attachment, specific one. Because when I think about Ruskin, I mean, I think about this. You talked about the Gothic, but this Orientalist flavor that Venice has. It's like an outpost of the Orient in Europe, Venice.
Well, two responses, because there were two different things. First of all, the interesting thing to me about what drew the British, particularly in the 19th century, and they did flood to Venice among other European sites, but they came to Venice because there was this very long literary history which educated British persons were familiar with, beginning, of course, with Shakespeare's Othello, the Moor of Venice, and of course, The Merchant of Venice. Everyone knew those two works. And of course, they're very, very atmospheric. Everyone also knew that Schiller had written a novel that was set in Venice, very dark and very interesting novel. There were a few other poets who had attempted to say something about Venice, but largely you have that tradition of Shakespeare and then subsequently Lord Byron, whose reputation shone above all other writers. And then, of course, you're already having a bunch of travel works, works of travel literature that are being published from about the late 17th century through the 18th century, which of course prepare people for the grand tour. And Venice is always one of those sites that is discussed. So I think there's a very rich literary heritage that explains something of the attraction of Venice, particularly to the British. And then only one other quick point, which is Ruskin really is very respected for one particular reason right now, and that is the fact that in describing the beauties of the Basilica of San Marco, he was the first art historian to recognize the influence of the East on a Western monument. Before, people had largely suggested that perhaps there was really nothing of much interest in the Arab world or in the Islamic world. And so the fact that Ruskin recognized the beauty of the Basilica came from the fact that there was this amalgamation of elements from both the Eastern and the Western cultures. This, of course, makes many people, contemporary people now, really respect the fact that he had that ability to acknowledge those kinds of influences.
I have a question for Massimo. I'm very struck by the paintings that you've shown. They're beautiful. And of course, one thinks of various other places around the world that just attracted painters. Florence, the Netherlands, the northern countries. I'm very struck by the lighting in the paintings. Can you say anything about the character of the lighting in Venice that drew people there?
Yes, I could mention a couple of comments made by some of the most illustrious visitors to Venice. I could mention what Goethe says, the German poet. He, when he got to Venice, he was struck by the light. Of course, he was riding a gondola through the lagoon, and that helped to capture all the reflections on the water, etc. And he talked about the Venetian school of painting. He actually referred to painters from the late Renaissance, Paolo Veronese and others. And he mentioned and he said that they were able to capture chiaro nel chiaro, which means clear in clear, as opposed to the chiaroscuro. Of course, Venice is also a place of chiaroscuro, because if you walk in the calles, etc., there is a wonderful play of light, but also you can be in the shadows. So that certainly mentioning the quality that is related to the presence of the water, clearly, is this interplay between the marble of the palaces or even the brick stone and the water. And this mirror games, let's say, played by water and stones around the city, clearly created this amazing effects of light, etc. But Canaletto, who painted hundreds and hundreds of views, it would belong to, he actually was in England for 10 years, and in 1747 he moved to England, he painted London, etc. But became fashionable because his paintings were considered almost like postcards, almost like photographs to some extent, realistic, and yet they were able to capture precisely that aura, of the city, that kind of magical light.
I love the continuity of the lineage also the fact that Canaletto was such an important painter of Venice. And of course, Ruskin had seen Canaletto's paintings and was influenced by them. J.M.W. Turner, of course, who was the great British painter of the 19th century, he was influenced by Canaletto and came specifically to do his own paintings of Venice. And of course, Ruskin was the great defender of J.M.W. Turner. And so there's a wonderful set of connective tissues there, you know, that sort of explain why one would come and influence others, and then they would influence still others, and so on. It was quite lovely how all of those connections worked.
I'm sorry, I was going to say that Turner could be considered the anti-Canaletto in a sense because of that kind of light takes over, in his paintings. So,
yes,
yeah.
It does. And he decides that he might rearrange the buildings along the Grand Canal because he might make them more aesthetic with a different arrangement from the actual, which I've always found very amusing. Lou, I have a question for you. Today, there was an article that we all shared about the return of the cruise ships to Venice. It's very distressing because, of course, we thought that the cruise ship business was going to be shut down from the Giudecca Canal, and now we learn not yet. Could you comment about that? I mean, how perilous is the business of the cruise ships?
There's a real tension in that. I can recall a few months ago articles about how the pandemic has adversely affected the economy of Venice. People aren't going there. So the economy was very flat. And so there's a real economic interest in reviving the cruise industry. But you're absolutely correct. The large cruise ships, the ones that carry thousands and thousands of people, do pose a threat. They churn up the water, which does lots of things. It spreads polluted waters, and also it has an effect on scouring, on eroding the barrier islands and along the channels. So it's problematic. And and aside from the crowds, the numbers of people, so there's a real tension in that. People want the tourist business. On the other hand, those large ships pose a real threat to the area.
I noted that in Dubrovnik a few years ago, they were experiencing exactly the same thing. And the Minister of Culture there had spoken to a group of us about the fact that not only is the port area being destroyed by the presence of these gigantic cruise ships, but then when 3,000 people disembark in a day, they're ruining the infrastructure of the city itself. The restaurants and all of the shops are completely overrun suddenly. And so they've been trying to figure out also exactly how to deal with this problem. But Venice is certainly more fragile than even Dubrovnik.
It's also interesting to me. I thought a bit, with the new Panama Canal, the Panama Canal expansion, that's had worldwide impact aside from the pandemic. There are many port facilities that have been expanded. The ships get larger, which means the port facilities get larger, which means there's more stress in the area. And so I wonder if the Port of Venice is going to be able to handle that kind of industrial maritime traffic.
Yes.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you to our other two speakers. I appreciate your candid remarks. I know there is so much information to share, so we appreciate the highlights and the stories that you've shared with us. I would love to switch gears to the many questions coming in. I'll invite our viewers to continue to submit your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as possible. So Lou, I'd actually like to kind of pick things back to you. We have several questions coming in about the rising sea levels, about climate change. So I'd actually like to start with this more specific one. So can you discuss how flooding has impacted the integrity of historic buildings in Venice and what the Ministry of Culture is doing to confront the potential impact of these irreplaceable ancient structures?
Well, the major effort has been by virtue of this MOSE project, Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico. I want an opportunity to speak bad Italian. and that's sort of what has captured many, many people's attention. And it's a project that was conceived back in the early 2000s. The construction began in 2002. And most of the heavy construction, those big things that I showed you in my slides, were completed in more or less the late teens, 2017, 18, 19. Those gates are in place. And since that time, for the last couple of years, we've been told that the project would be completed, the last few percent. And yet the project has been fraught with enormous numbers of problems. It's not completed. And much of the issue has to do with, I think, management issues. And there are questions regarding how these gates should be, how much meteorologic heads up time do you need before deploying the gates? What is the cost of deploying the gates? What are the flood levels at which the gates get deployed? How long should the gates be up? And there's this other enormous problem, is that the MOSE project was paid by the national government. And so there's a real tension about who has authority, the Venetian officials or the government. So the MOSE project was, of course, one of the major ways that people were trying to provide some protection to the important monumental structures. And it's not there yet. It provide and by the way, I thought about it this morning. This particular project is an example of the challenges that people face in all large public projects and in all kinds of public decision making. Think of the decision making and management issues associated with the pandemic, both in the U.S. and other countries around the world. Those kinds of decisions are difficult to make, and I think that's what we have here. With respect to specific structures, I couldn't comment. There is this movement for architectural preservation, the development of resilience. Resilience is now a word that people like to use. But I think that the major effort in Venice is by virtue of this project.
Thank you. Massimo, I'd like to hand this one over to you. How would you characterize the transformation in the image of Venice, and what attracted grand tourists and artists to the city in the 18th century compared with the 19th and 20th centuries?
Well, the Grand Tour dates back to the 16th century, at least. Starts and then picks up in the 17th century, and the 18th century is like the peak. It continues on in the early 19th century, but of course it is soon replaced to some extent by the popularization of travel and tourism and the rise of modern tourism as we conceive it. So, and of course, Venice as a place is undergoing profound transformations in this during this time. The most important date for modern Venice is right after the Napoleon's invasion of Italy, which brought to Italy the rise of patriotism and independent, this movement of independence, so had some positive effects, but also was an invasion, and Venice lost its independence in 1796, and Napoleon soon traded Venice to Austria, and Venice was under Austrian control, the empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, until mid-19th century, and when it became Italian in 1867. So grand tourists would go to Venice not only because of the many attractions, the carnival, the arts, the music, the food, but also because Venice represented the longest standing republic in Europe, 9th century old in the 18th century. So it was a kind of a model. Of course, it was a very special kind of a republic. It was a oligarchy, an aristocratic republic. The Doge, the Duke, was elected, but it was elected by a small circle of aristocrats in the Grand Concilio and so on. So but it was still a model, a republican model. So there was that attraction, going to Venice to experiment, the life of the city, as also from this point of view. Later on, of course, with Turner and Ruskin, etc., the appeal of the city changed entirely, became romanticized. It was a city of decadence, a city where you could breathe this sense of old glories and a current sort of decadence, and the pleasure of life as a result of that long decadence. Venetians certainly knew how to live their life, and the city was. So this was perhaps the major change. And of course, with mass tourism, everything changes again, and we have seen that a little bit. So that's more or less in a nutshell, the profound transformation in the image of Venice.
Thank you. Sue, can you explain further why Ruskin believed that the Gothic style was superior to all other architectural styles?
Yes, I will try to summarize the 3 volumes of the Stones of Venice as best I can. Part of what's interesting to me is that Ruskin is not a Roman Catholic, and he is not trying to defend Roman Catholicism by defending the Gothic. This is a misunderstanding that many people often have about it, because the Gothic, of course, is so associated with all of the great cathedrals that were being built from the 11th and 12th and early 13th centuries, and all of them in the Gothic style. But he's not trying to defend that on specific doctrinal grounds, or he's not trying to defend specifically the Roman Catholic religion. In fact, he's actually trying to articulate a more secular theory of Gothic while using some of the same attributes that were associated with the Catholic use of Gothic in the building of the cathedrals. By that, I mean that he wants to associate Gothicism with a kind of spirituality, a kind of spiritual devotion that is represented in the beautiful Gothic arches, that is represented in the flying buttresses, that direct the viewer's eyes upward to heaven. All of that he appreciates very much, but especially, and this is again where, why writers like Marx and others have really appreciated Ruskin, because he sort of romanticizes the life of the workman who worked on the Gothic cathedrals. He believes that they were free men, that they were working in the service of something that they believed to be noble and spiritual, and that they were given a free hand to design as they wished. This is why he doesn't like Renaissance architecture and neoclassical architecture, because he believes that by that time, a set of rules had been given to architects about how they were to create a building, and that those rules were very rigid. Gothicism he sees as something very creative, and he associates it very much with the freedom of the craftsman to engage in imaginative sculpture, where you've got these wonderful sort of gargoyles and fantastical creatures and all of that, but where they truly try to represent nature as they experienced it in reality. Beautiful foliage, beautiful leaves, fruits, flowers, making the cathedral look like the sacred forest inside. And so to him, this is a much more expressive kind of architecture, but it also implies a kind of aesthetic freedom, which was no longer allowed by the time one gets to Renaissance and neoclassical architecture.
Thank you. Lou, I'm going to pass this one over to you. We did hear you talk a little bit about Aqua Alta early on in your presentation, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that and the engineering controls.
Well, the interesting thing about the Aqua Alta events is their frequent low-level floods. And that's different from the large catastrophic floods, for example, that we could associate with Hurricane Katrina of 2004, or Tropical Storm Sandy. They are a result partly of the meteorological conditions associated with the region. The Adriatic Sea, if you look at a map, is very, very long and narrow. It's bound on 3 sides. And the meteorology of the area tends to blow storms up the Adriatic to the Venetian area. You've also got these other problems. You've got these standing waves. In some respects, the Adriatic is like a 3-sided bathtub. And imagine, somebody jumping into the bathtub and what happens. It's a mess. And so the aqua alta events are in part a function of the local meteorology. But in addition, the aqua alta events are being aggravated by the rising sea levels. And the plot I showed you, by the way, is a retrospective look at rising sea levels. This is not a talk on climate change, but for those of you that are familiar with it, there are numerous scenarios which suggest that sea levels may rise at an accelerating rate compared to what we've seen historically. But the other thing that makes Venice, the Venetian situation, even more complicated, it's a city that's subsiding. In my reading list, by the way, I've given you a short paper which describes, it gives you examples of urban subsidence, cities that settle. Venice is built on soft ground, and so it settles. So the combination of meteorological conditions, the rising sea level, the lowering of land level, aggravate the tendency for aqua alta events. And if you look for those of you that look carefully at my plot of aqua alta events on a timeline, you can see they're becoming more frequent with time, and they're becoming more severe with time, which, by the way, is one of the things we associate as well with climate change, more frequent severe events. So I can't be like the evening weatherman. I can't be a positive voice for this. It's only going to become more challenging.
So Lou, the message is hurry to Venice before it's too late. But then if everybody goes there, then
that's right. I don't want to editorialize.
So this next question, I think I could probably pose to Massimo and Sue. So please feel free to jump in, either of you. What impact did mass tourism have on the artist presence in the city?
Well, you've heard what James had to say about, and of course he got there late. In a sense, we are already in the when he writes those words, we are already in the early 20th century. So mass tourism is already a reality, etc. But of course, tourism and the city of art, Venice as the city of art attraction are intertwined. Because of course, not only attracting this very well-educated grant who was part of their education was their academy. This was an itinerant academy, and Italy was the garden, and Venice was a stop. But during the modern times, with the creation of the Biennale in the 20th century, and also the film festival that was actually established by the Mussolini regime in the 1930s, to counter the influence of Hollywood, etc. So this idea of the Venice as the city of art became a part of the touristic promotion, and there's been a tension there. At first the city catered for elite tourists, and the artists were certainly part of this elite, but then later on they tried to balance, perhaps not perfectly, this idea of a mass tourism, which is good for the economy up to a certain point, and of course elite tourism, which is still part of the of the cachet of Venice.
Now, Byron, of course, definitely wanted to be in Venice during Carnival. That was, for him, part of the excitement of the city, was to be there when there were these crowds and crowds of people behaving badly. But it's interesting to see that many of the writers did exactly what we are starting to do now, which is trying to figure out where there are periods in the year where one can go and visit, where it's a little quieter, where you don't have quite so many tourists flooding the city and where there aren't cruise ships and so on. Unfortunately, what you have to deal with then often is bad weather. So the tourists are avoiding those specific months because they're going to be heavy rains or, chilly weather or something like that. But it became early on a game with many of these writers, and particularly intellectuals who wanted to, spend quieter time in Venice, to seek out those very few times of the year when it was possible to go without necessarily being trampled by the tourists. That's only become more difficult for us, I'm afraid.
By the way,
Yes. Go ahead.
as an engineer, I had to quantify things. So when I heard that number, I've heard numbers as high as 20 to 37 million tourist visits a year to Venice. I had to wrap my head around that. And so I divided it by 365. So on average, how many people are in Venice a day? Tourists. It's a number it's like 100,000, something like that. It's just enormous. It's a lot of people.
Especially since some of the cruise ships that are arriving have nearly 3,000 passengers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, for a cruise ship to have only 1,000 passengers is something of a relief, I think, to the Venetians. But what you get is these gigantic cruise ships, and several of them arriving every week, that have that many people disembarking at once. That's the real nightmare, I think.
And it's not only the cruise ship; it's also from land. There's daily visitors who come and with buses. They park their buses at the in the parking lots and enter the city, stay one day, don't spend any money really, because they bring their own lunch, etc., etc. So that's why I was saying the daily visitors for the city are not entirely.
I think we just lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. It's I was saying that those daily visitors are more of a problem, environmental problem, than an economic event. Right now, the Venetians are, eager to see the city reopen to tourism because, of course, its economy depends entirely. So, but the intention.
Well, we have surpassed our time. That went by so quickly. Thank you so much to our esteemed speakers. We have learned so much today, and on behalf of Brown, Harvard, and the Tufts alumni communities, thank you so much for sharing your deep knowledge and your love of Venice with us today. You've inspired us to continue to learn more. And to this point, all of our viewers today will receive a follow-up email from your affiliated alumni organization, including the recording of this lecture and some other resources to enjoy. So thank you again for spending your afternoon with the Shared Departures team, and we wish you well. Thank you.